In order to quickly get behind the wheel of the coveted King of the 100 Tons, the Pakistani owner spent 100,000 rupees to buy a heavily damaged, completely burned out vehicle and planned to spend another 50,000 rupees to refurbish and repair it. Today, we are here to observe how a fire-damaged scrap vehicle transforms into a new one. The star of today's refurbishment is an oil tanker that has been reduced to just its shell. Apart from the slightly wider wheel hubs, the rest of the vehicle is charred black. To facilitate the disassembly and refurbishment of the truck, the entire oil tank needed to be separated from the chassis frame. However, since the fixed bolts could no longer be loosened, the mechanic had to take the risk of using acetylene cutting. To prevent any further ignition during the process, the repair shop's fire extinguisher was kept on standby. As expected, the inevitable happened. Sparks reignited the residues inside the tank. Fortunately, the cutting of the bottom was completed without further incident. Next, a crane was used to separate the oil tank from the truck. Although the oil tank had been through intense fire, with the simple refurbishment skills of Pakistani mechanics, what seemed like a scrap tank could be made usable again. The most affected part, however, was the truck's chassis. All combustible parts were completely burned away. Before officially refurbishing the truck, the mechanics needed to assess the damage to calculate how many parts needed replacement. Clearly, aside from the iron components, the entire truck required new parts for reassembly. To remove the rust from the entire vehicle, the chassis had to be dismantled until only a single bolt remained. Although the disassembly process was very challenging, Pakistan has no shortage of mechanics. With their well-organized teamwork, the disassembly of the entire truck's front end was completed very quickly. Despite the battle-scarred state of the cab, it didn't hinder the mechanics' refurbishment efforts at all. After they swiftly hoisted the engine, the chassis was reduced to just a skeleton. Since the original frame had deformed, the mechanics needed to completely dismantle the chassis to straighten it using a hydraulic press. The crossbeams, which were riveted in place, could be easily removed by breaking off the rivet heads. However, the front and rear axles had compressed the frame tightly, so the mechanics had to not only remove the remnants of the tires but also deal with the exposed steel wires. These tires were beyond repair, even for the mechanics. After disassembling the leaf springs of the rear axle, the two main beams, now free from the constraints of the balance axle, were finally detached. To avoid delaying the truck's refurbishment, the bodywork and paint specialists began working on the cab. Since the front end hadn't been impacted by external forces, the bodywork was relatively straightforward. Using body hammers to meticulously shape the metal, they were able to smooth out the minor dents. After the professional bodywork, the cab met the necessary standards. To ensure the paint had a smooth finish, the entire surface was skim-coated with putty to level out any minor depressions. Although their use of putty was so precise that it couldn't be detected by a paint film gauge, they prioritized the final result. Since the owner wanted to convert the truck into a King of the 100 Tons dump truck, the mechanics needed to enhance the chassis' load-bearing capacity. They did this by bending new steel plates to increase the number of frame plates, allowing the truck to carry more cargo. After crafting the new frame, it was clear that the original frame had been severely deformed. The deformed parts still need to be pressed down and corrected by a hydraulic press. Although the repair shop is fully capable of replacing the chassis with a new one, the original chassis holes are precise, eliminating the need for measurements when installing the chassis components. This is why the original factory chassis is embedded. The newly bent and thickened chassis can provide support for the repaired chassis, preventing metal fatigue from causing cracks. Now, the master will use the pressure of the hydraulic press to completely press the two chassis together, ensuring the chassis strength meets usage requirements. After all, the original car chassis has been high-temperature heated and annealed. Once there is no gap between the two layers of the chassis, the sides of the steel plate need to be spot-welded with welding rods to make the two layers of the chassis whole. At this point, these two reinforced chassis can be spliced with the original factory chassis components. However, because full welding of the side gaps leaves weld scars, to maintain aesthetics, the surface of the weld scars needs to be repeatedly polished with an angle grinder. When the new outer layer of the chassis covers the original factory hole positions, the master must use a drill to match and open the holes in the chassis to prevent the chassis components from being unable to connect with the chassis. After drilling all the hole positions on the surface of the chassis, the reassembly work of the chassis can begin. To conveniently fix the distance between the chassis, the master needs to temporarily fix the front crossbeam with bolts and use their clamps to make fine adjustments to the spacing of the chassis at the rear, ensuring that the subsequent crossbeam fixing hole positions align. As the masters skillfully reposition the crossbeam, they also need to use a level to measure if the chassis is tilted. This is also key to drilling holes for the cab mounting brackets. After the master's precise calculation with a tape measure, the points on both sides are marked. Although the original factory leaf springs have also been heated, However, to save costs on this refurbishment, the owner did not replace the chassis components. Moreover, such a temperature would not cause significant impact. At this point, the chassis, which has already been sprayed with anti-rust primer, still needs to be re-drilled using an electric drill, because the mounting holes for the suspension brackets can only be drilled during installation. This prevents any deviation in hole spacing. Although the front axle has not yet been fully installed, to expedite the process, the masters first need to verify the points for the cab. With the bottom temporarily fixed with bolts, they then conduct a lift test on the cab. Once the issues with the front end are resolved, the rear installation requires only the master's swift hands to reinstall all the components in their original positions. Despite not having high-end electric wrenches, their speed in tightening bolts is not slow. The entire rear axle assembly is installed quickly. Since the original engine of the vehicle was scrapped, the owner directly ordered a brand new engine. Although the transmission is from the original vehicle, this still gives the owner a new car experience. Now that the truck assembly is complete, it needs to be painted according to the owner's requirements. After a simple paint matching by the painter, this accident-burned truck is fully restored. Not only has it received a brand new engine, but even the interior has been crafted to new car standards.